Hi, and welcome back to Free Space News. Today I want to talk about an issue that Americans know all too well because it's one of the most frequent stories that appears on the news, and especially when it's on, it just seems to... We have this same cycle that we go through every single time it happens, and that is the issue of gun violence. Now, this past week there was a shooting in Illinois. The shooting was at a manufacturing factory, and 5 people were killed and several more were injured. Really an awful circumstance of events, and in most countries this would be one of the biggest stories of the year, but in the United States there's a good chance that a lot of people are going to not remember this shooting after a certain amount of time, just because of how frequently these kinds of things happen in America. Now today I want to go back to a little bit more than a year ago and talk about the Parkland shooting that happened at a high school in Florida, because that happened on Valentine's Day 2018, and this past Thursday was Valentine's Day, which means it's now been a year since the Parkland shooting happened. Now, for a lot of people my age, I think Parkland is one of those events where it's kind of like a flashbulb memory, where we remember exactly where we were when we heard the news, exactly what we were doing, and we have a clear picture in our mind of what was going on when that story broke to us. Now today with this story I want to focus on what exactly has changed since the Parkland shooting around the issue of gun control, gun reform, that kind of a thing. So there's a really good article from The Insider that came out a couple of days ago, which I think does a really good job of detailing what exactly has been passed, and along with that points out what hasn't been changed as well. So there's 3 points in the article that I want to take a look at in terms of things that have changed, and the first one has to do with the issue of what's known as red flag laws. So the article says, quote, "One of the most widely supported measures to spring from the aftermath of the Parkland shooting are known as red flag laws, which give police and courts the authority to use a restraining order to temporarily confiscate a person's guns if they're deemed a danger to themselves or others. Since the Parkland shooting, 9 states, including Florida, and a number of localities have implemented red flag laws. An Associated Press analysis found that more than 1,700 restraining orders were issued in 2018 alone that allowed authorities to temporarily seize guns from people considered at risk." So in my opinion, this is a very incremental approach to gun reform. For example, they said that only 9 states have passed these kinds of laws since Parkland. However, on this kind of issue, to me, any kind of progress is good, and this red flag laws approach in particular is actually a really good idea. While the types of shootings that get the most attention in America are committed with assault rifles, like the Parkland shooting, like Columbine, like Sandy Hook, obviously that's a big problem, and that produces the greatest amount of deaths because you have a weapon that can kill people a lot faster. However, it shouldn't be ignored that most gun violence in America is committed with handguns, and oftentimes these kinds of acts of violence can result from kind of domestic abuse situations or just kind of intercommunal violence or whatever. And when authorities deem somebody at risk, I would argue that it is important that they at least temporarily lose access to firearms, just so that these kinds of acts of violence can be prevented. And again, that accounts for most of the gun violence in America. Another important element mentioned in the article is the idea of universal background checks. So they say, quote, "Currently all federally licensed gun dealers must conduct a background check for each purchase, but gun control advocates have argued that the laws are too loose and exclude private gun sales. On Wednesday, the House Judiciary Committee approved a measure that would require all gun sales and most gun transfers in the country to undergo background checks. The measure that has already garnered some support among Republican lawmakers and is set for a vote on the House floor." So if you're not familiar with gun laws in the United States, what they're referring to there is what's often called the Gun Show Loophole. And what it essentially means is that if you're buying a gun somewhere where there has to be a federally licensed dealer, they are required legally to do a background check on you. But if you're buying the gun at a gun show, or you're exchanging the gun privately with a family member, or someone you found on Craigslist or whatever, there's no requirement for a background check. As such, since none of these transfers typically are logged into any kind of database, since there's no background check on them, it's very hard to know what kind of people are getting their hands on these kinds of weapons. Another thing you may not know is that support for universal background checks in America is up to about 90%. And that's interesting because you often hear that gun control in America is a very contentious issue. However, if you actually go policy for policy, the vast majority of Americans support most of the gun control regulations that have been pushed by the Democrats as well as some Republicans in the past few years. While I personally think that background checks are a very good idea and would probably reduce the amount of gun violence in the United States, I do think that if you still have the number of guns that we have in the United States, there are going to be people that are going to be able to get their hands on them in some form. Now, I'm not coming from the typical right-wing argument of that doesn't mean we shouldn't do background checks. I'm just saying that we might have to go several steps further in order to actually get effective progress on the issue. Lastly, I think one of the most important things that they touched on in the article was the idea of political mobilization as a result of the Parkland shooting. So they say, quote, "A primary target of the March for Our Lives movement was the midterm elections, where they focused on electing gun control advocates and ousting pro-gun ones. Beyond that, the student activists at the center of the gun violence prevention movement have been waging a public war against the National Rifle Association, which backs candidates who support gun rights. The midterms yielded a mixed bag of results for both sides. 88 of the 129 candidates the NRA backed ultimately won their races, according to the Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence. Yet, the gun control advocates claimed some victories as well, defeating roughly 24 pro-gun candidates in House races." So it's, as they say, a very mixed bag. I think people on both sides of the debate here are probably unhappy about how it went. For example, I would say I'm largely in the gun control camp, I would argue that ousting 24 candidates is a little bit depressingly low given how many mass shootings we've had in the past few years. However, people on the pro-gun side of the debate would certainly argue that 24 is quite a bit, and that means that there's going to be 24 new people who don't support gun rights. There's a little bit of an issue of correlation versus causation here too, because yes, while 88 of the 129 candidates backed by the NRA were re-elected, most of those people are Republicans, and most people in Congress anyway are likely to get re-elected just for name recognition purposes, for reasons of being popular, or at least popular enough to get elected on other issues. So there's lots of reasons why these 88 people could be re-elected, and not the 24 who were ousted by pro-gun control candidates. If I have to be honest with you, I'm a little disappointed with how little has gotten done since the Parkland shooting. I personally was fairly active in trying to mobilize support for gun control reform after the Parkland shooting. For example, I attended the Fort Collins March for Our Lives protests, and what really struck me about those protests was that was how much people were actually mobilized after this particular shooting. I mean, I was a little bit surprised with after the Sandy Hook massacre. Sandy Hook, not only did more people die than in Parkland, but they were first graders, people who didn't even really have the chance to, go to their first high school dance. And I just would have thought that after that there would have been so much more mobilization, and really after a while it just seemed like there was a lot of pity for the victims of Sandy Hook, and there was a lot of outrage at politicians who didn't want to do anything, but that outrage didn't result in protests and organization anywhere near like what happened with Parkland, and it didn't result with as much of an increase in incremental reform like background checks, red flag laws, etc. that I've gone over in this video. Now, because of that, it felt so different to me. I sort of thought like, wow, this is really going to be like the turning point. This is where people are actually going to stand up to their representatives, and they're going to pressure their local representatives on these issues to the point where we're actually going to get lots and lots of sensible reform passed. But unfortunately, there's still a ton of states that haven't taken any steps whatsoever to address gun violence. I also think that a part of why these things keep happening so frequently has a little bit to do with how we treat guns in America. In America, we do have the Second Amendment to the Constitution, which says something to the effect of a well-regulated militia being necessary to secure the free state, the rights of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, there's a little bit of debate as to whether or not as to what that means. Some people think that the Second Amendment is rock solid, and means that people should be able to have unlimited access to guns because it says the rights to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Other people think that because of the well-regulated militia clause, that it's appropriate to regulate guns in certain ways. Or there's the interpretation that the well-regulated militia clause only really is calling for the establishment of some sort of police force or equivalent militia to secure the citizens of a free state. The fact that we have the Second Amendment, an amendment to our Constitution pertaining to guns at all, just kind of shows how much more we value guns than in the rest of the world. The rest of the world essentially treats them as a privilege, not as something that citizens need to protect themselves, but as something that you would use to hunt or perhaps to protect yourself but you would have to go through much more regulation to get a gun, and in some cases you wouldn't be able to get a gun to protect yourself. Australia, for example, doesn't treat guns like a right in the same way that the United States does in their constitution. And after the 1996 Port Arthur massacre, they implemented gun control, and they haven't had a mass shooting since. Here's a little bit more detail about what exactly they implemented. So according to an article from the Herald Sun, in Australia, guns must be registered, automatic and semi-automatic weapons are banned. More than 650,000 guns were destroyed in a buyback scheme. Gun owners must have a valid reason for owning a weapon, including farming or hunting. Guns and ammunition must be locked and stored appropriately. A second gun amnesty ran between July 1st to September 30th this year, collecting another 260,000 guns. And states must adhere to the Firearms Act of 1996 and Weapons Prohibition Act of 1998. Now that last part I think says a lot. The fact that the Firearms Act were called the Firearms Act of 1996 and the Weapons Prohibition Act of 1998. That means that all this legislation was passed, implemented, etc. within 1 to 2 years of the Port Arthur massacre, which again happened in 1996. So they had the biggest mass shooting in their history, and they immediately said, okay, we need to implement drastic reform in order to get rid of gun violence. And as a result, they've had 0 mass shootings since. And as you can see, a lot of the reforms listed here go a lot further than what the US states are proposing. And even when you see the Parkland kids, who experience gun violence themselves talk about the issue of gun control, they tend to lead with, hey, we respect the Second Amendment and we don't want to infringe on gun rights, which is not the kind of approach that Australian politicians approach their citizens with. There's a video on YouTube of a conservative Australian politician talking to a crowd of hundreds, if not thousands of people, and saying that we have to do gun control, there's no other way.
I'm sorry about that, but there is no other way. There is no other way. Bullshit, Johnny! And it is always...
Whereas in America you have one party that's more or less funded by the NRA, and another party that's still that wants to put in some kinds of reforms, but these reforms are don't go nearly as far as what they did in Australia. And unfortunately, I think until the United States implements similar policies to Australia, the gun violence in the United States is still going to be probably among the highest in the world. So that's going to do it for today's video. Make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment down in the comment section, and I will see you guys in the next video.